So glad to be here with you all. For those that are just joining, there's an invitation as you join to share in the chat anything in particular around building just and resilient economies that you are curious about today, or what is alive in you that brought you to join us on this webinar today. And that would be helpful for me as we navigate these remote Zoom learning opportunities, these GoToWebinar learning opportunities, to have this be as interactive as possible. So as Mark mentioned, my name is Erin Axelrod. I am a partner worker owner at a worker-owned impact consulting firm by the name of Lift Economy. And in terms of my bio or what brings me to this work, I have a background in agroecology and food systems, really in solidarity with agroecology movements around the globe. And I live in, I'm from Sonoma County in Northern California, and currently living in the East Bay of Northern California, just a little bit north of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay watershed. So I don't have a kind of business background in your traditional sense of the word. I actually intentionally opted out of a master's in business administration due to the fact that so much of the kind of business education that is available to many people is so often perpetuating some of the status quo problems that I see out in the world. And so my business acumen really stems from about 8 years of on-the-ground business consulting, working with entrepreneurs that are trying to navigate the really intractable challenges that our current economic system poses for us. And so with that being said, the presentation that I'm going to give today is really designed particularly for this audience, because I see that many of you have learned from folks like Mark Shepard and other regenerative agriculture practitioners. I wanted to share just a window into one sector of the economic transition that Lift Economy sees as an opportunity, and one place we've been putting our energy and devoting our attention. And hopefully it will ring true for many of you as well, that this is a good place to put energy. So hopefully folks can see that. And
yes, I can see it.
Great. And Alicia, to your point about this question around, looking for new opportunities and ideas, lifelong learning goals. And yes, that's my personal website. Thanks, Alicia. I have a couple writings on that website around how we can really live just and resilient values in our day-to-day lives. So hopefully you find that useful. And yes, those are my podcasts. So yeah, Lift Economy is the executive producer of a podcast called The Next Economy Now, where we look for entrepreneurs that are really on the cutting edge of transforming our economic system to make it more just and equitable. And we hope that our podcast kind of illuminates some of the solutions that abound right now of entrepreneurs and how they're changing the way we do business. So the reason I picked this topic of building resilient communities is it's something that many of us can relate to. And I just want to honor and open this webinar with recognizing that much of the globe is in shelter in place right now around the COVID crisis, and that even the privilege of sitting here safely sheltered. Many of you, all of you have access to a computer, and many of you, I imagine, have access to safe homes, plenty of food. that in and of itself is a privilege, and one I think to hold in the context of, for me, the responsibility associated with that privilege is the need to urgently curb the emissions associated with my day-to-day life. And so the things I'll cover in this presentation around building truly resilient communities is really around how we can imagine and reimagine shelter, households, communities, neighborhoods that can really support a sort of baseline meeting of human needs that can be sustainable across many different positionalities. So again, my positionality is I am in the Northern California Bay Area. And so just to ground in a few of the shared kind of, I won't belabor this, but there's a need to kind of get on the same page around what the context of the world we're living in. And so many of you know about the degradation of forest resources. I don't have to belabor it other than to say, from 2001 to 2018, we lost 9% of the global tree cover. So there's deforestation. There's also increasing desertification of the world's arable places to grow food. And with COVID, we're seeing that, the world's malnourished or without access to ample sustenance for survival is going to, at minimum, double and likely increase even more than that. We have, settlements that are full of trash and contaminated, and this is an image from the Southern Hemisphere, but there's plenty of images right here in my own backyard of Oakland, kind of shanty towns and favelas that, are really shelterless populations with inadequate access to sanitation and all of these issues associated with that. And then, of course, we're seeing that, 8 men have as much wealth as 3.6 billion people, and Jeff Bezos made $25 billion in January 2020, while the rest of us were looking at this, imminent crisis around COVID. And so the inequity is really being exacerbated by COVID, COVID is not the equalizer that we might hope it to be. So with all of this, and given this larger context, I like to hold a framing that we borrow from the two curves model that Deb Fries and Margaret Wheatley out of the Berkana Institute has put forward, which is that people are simultaneously on the planet trying to address this business as usual economy in a number of different ways. And so sort of this dotted line at the top represents the endless growth curve, the business as usual economy that would insist that we can continue to have endless growth, and that's the only path of development really that our world's population can envision. So within that, though, there are a number of people looking to change that trajectory, and we kind of look at it in two ways. One is the hospice. So the folks that are on the front lines of working within existing systems, but actually trying to help those systems die as compassionately as possible, right? I like to say that, I love Patagonia, right? The Patagonia B Corp is a great model. I work with them, I know Rose. And if all the companies in the world today became like Patagonia, we would still have all the problems that I just mentioned. We still would not have an Earth that could be, that we would still not be living within our planetary boundaries. And so this idea of actually hospicing out and helping systems decline, systems of perpetual purchasing patterns, systems of perpetual growth, systems of the dependent producer and the global consumer. That type of relationship is unsustainable because it inherently leaves us away from the need to become more in relation to what we use and eat and consume on a daily basis. So the flip side of that, or the alternative to that, would be the midwifery opportunity, which is, this is kind of the place where I sit most in my work, is midwifing in solutions that are creating a completely viable alternative to the business as usual economy. So this midwife approach of how do we create clothing that, unlike the Patagonia example I mentioned, is not just reliant on recycled petrochemicals that were originally sourced from, petroleum-based materials, but who's midwifing in the carbon sequestering wool hemp blended fiber that is antimicrobial, that we can wear with the assurance that clothing actually sequestered more carbon in the growing of it than was emitted in the production and weaving and creation of that garment in the first place. And if you're interested and curious about that type of example, I would have you look to FiberShed, which is an amazing organization that I work with, and my client Winona LaDuke. She is creating a regenerative bioregional hemp textile economy on white earth. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So again, Lift Economy works in all of the different sectors of the economy, but one that I'll talk about today is the building resilient communities. And this is particularly important, this kind of building sector, because as I mentioned, when we look at climate catastrophe and climate crisis, 70.8 million people are going to be displaced throughout the world because of war, natural disasters, and extreme poverty. And so we know that we're going to need to shelter populations. Can we do it in a way that doesn't have so much concrete? Concrete is one of the leading causes of carbon emissions globally, the production of concrete, not to mention the mining of precious minerals like sand to produce that concrete. And if any questions come up, it looks like we're a small group, so there's about 15 attendees. If any questions come up at any time, please raise your hand. Mark, if you could help kind of stop me at any time if questions come up.
Yeah.
I'd like to keep this as interactive as possible.
Right, and Dr. Wayne Dorband is with us. He just came in.
Great.
Right, in case you didn't notice. But and I'm sure he had some questions for you as well. Do you want to?
Great.
So how?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's pause and invite Wayne in. I'd love to, Wayne, if you want to.
Wow, I just am feeling stupid because I have no good excuse for being late. I'm not going to talk about it, but I'll give you a little. I was starting a jigsaw puzzle that I started, and I said I got 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden it was 10 minutes. Oh no!
I love it. That's a perfectly excusable reason to be late, and I love that you're using that sort of way to spend time in these moments. We need to be.
So, wife and I have done two now, and they're hard ones. They're like 1,000 pieces, and we just enjoy doing it together. She had to still do alpaca work. I still had to do the webinar. I had to do, but we just got caught in time. I've been here for about 6 or 7 minutes, so you've been doing great, Erin. I'll be monitoring the question. There is one here. Is the best site to look for info about you ErinAxelrod.com or LiftEconomy.com, or really both of them?
I think both of them, but really the Lift Economy site is reflective of the work that I do in the world with the team that I work with. We're 6 members of a worker-owned cooperative, so I would look there first. We also have some resources for folks there, like we're starting the next cohort of our MBA course and other resources like our podcast and newsletter. So I would look to Lift Economy first.
Well, that's super. Everybody, again, put some questions in. Erin's she's an amazing thinker. There's nothing she's saying today that she hasn't thought through over and over and over and refined if she needed to. So put your questions in. I think that's all that's out there right now, Erin. I'm going to have more for you after you go a little bit more. So why don't you just keep going?
Thank you so much. Okay. So Many of you are familiar with this idea or concept of regenerative forest management. I just wanted to highlight this because I think it's so, there's so much myth around kind of, I mentioned the issue with carbon emissions, concrete in our built environment. And I've been working with a natural builder by the name of Massey Burke, who has really helped me reimagine wood material as a potential beneficial input into building our shelters, building our homes in a way that actually is regenerative to the ecosystems within which we abide. And just a little bit of context for why the building industry, why I wanted to focus on this industry today. You know, I mentioned I'm from Sonoma County, and we've seen just really an extreme amount of wildfires, not just in Sonoma County, but also in Southern California. And of course, we saw them in Australia, in Montana, all across our globe. We're seeing this increase and uptick in wildfires and extreme weather. We can actually manage our forests in such a way that we are thinning out woody material that would actually perpetuate and catalyze more of that woody, the wildfire. And, you know, with these fires, we're losing structures. So 31,000 structures lost in just 2017 and 2018 alone in California. And simultaneously, top home builders in the country sold more than 160,000 homes in 2017. And the number of units is going to continue to increase. The need for housing is not decreasing, of course, especially with changing weather patterns and the migration patterns that we're going to be seeing due to climate change. And so I want to lead us into this conversation about building resilient communities with the posit that what if we were to build shelters that could actually be a carbon sink? So many of you may be familiar with Project Drawdown. My business partner, Kevin Bayuk, is the Senior Financial Fellow for Project Drawdown, so has worked on that book, as well as the more recent Project Drawdown review that came out in March. So a lot of our work is informed by this principle that we actually need to align around a comprehensive plan to reverse and mitigate global warming. What if we thought of our housing and our building in that same way? So I want to share an example of a company that's doing such a thing. Whole Trees Structures is using round pole timber. So this is actually keeping the whole of the tree intact rather than slicing it up into lumber, which actually makes the material on par to some of the strength to weight ratio of steel. So these round poles, these are from selectively thinned forests, that the forests are actually becoming healthier as a result of this selective forestry, this selective thinning. And there's some great images online. I don't have them in this presentation, but there's images of the Cleveland Zoo with the tiger, if you can imagine a tiger climbing on such a structure. It's really been amazing to see. There's an image of a grocery store that has these round pole timber construction. So you're walking through grocery store aisles, if you can imagine, and you're surrounded by these round pole timber frame construction. And so I wanted to just name a company that I think is doing some really amazing work. And they are a B Corp, which for those that aren't familiar with the B Corp, it's actually a structure by which you can bake the ecological benefits and social justice benefits into your business structure. Lift Economy is a B Corp, Patagonia is a B Corp. There's a number, 2,700 B Corps around the world that are aligning around a global movement around this. So that's regenerative forest management. Now, getting into another element of the building resilient communities puzzle is carbon sequestering fire resistant buildings. And I see this question around the price comparison between these wood poles and steel concrete. That is a great question, and I would just encourage you to do your research and contact Whole Trees, particularly if you have projects in the queue that might be relevant. I don't know that off the top of my head. So another element of the built environment is, so not just putting timber or wood and as a carbon sequestration element in the built environment, but actually using regeneratively sourced straw. Much of the straw in California, this is wheat straw, rice straw, oat straw, that the grain has been harvested off, and it either gets incinerated, burned, or just goes back into the field and then oxidizes that carbon back into the environment. Not necessarily a bad thing, it's just that humans have so dramatically shifted the carbon balance that we now need to get really creative, right, about drawing down that carbon and locking it up in permanently sequestered means. So one creative visionary solution would be to actually harvest that waste straw that we've already put, water and human energy and resources into growing, and locking it up in the building environment in straw bale. Many of you have seen straw bale buildings, but actually thinking about it as a carbon drawdown solution. Incidentally, these straw bale buildings have been shown to be more fire resilient. I have pictures in another presentation around many of straw bale homes that were completely intact, and everything around them was burned during the Tubbs fires and other fires. So I can share more resources for those that are interested about that. So I'll go through these kind of quick just to give the whole picture, but linked to both the carbon sequestering fire resilient buildings and the regenerative forestry management is disaster preparedness. Like I mentioned, these building homes that are more resilient to fires, and then workforce development. Really creating more equitable solutions for the inequities that I mentioned at the top of this webinar, and helping others really align their 100 waking hours in a week with work that is life-affirming, meaningful, and contributing to the solution rather than contributing to some of the problems. So regenerative agriculture, I already mentioned this a bit in terms of the sourcing of the straw. We can actually even level up a little bit more on the carbon sequestration benefits through the whole world of growing things in such a way as to increase the soil carbon content of the way that straw was grown. And so you all may be intermediate to expert on this realm since you've been following folks like Mark Shepard, Elaine Ingham. One of the really amazing places that I look to for a lot of my data and research is the Marin Carbon Project, where they actually laid out a half-inch layer of compost on rangelands in California and found that just that half-inch layer application of compost increased the carbon sequestration capacity of the rangelands by 1 ton of carbon per hectare, which means that if we increase that across 5% of California's rangeland by applying compost, we would actually offset all the emissions associated from California's agriculture and timber sectors. So a lot of potential there. There's also holistic grazing that also catalyzes soil carbon increases, and just a number of other really creative approaches that I won't belabor because these are the practitioners really that are the pros in this, and I'm really thinking from the economic system, how do we weave these elements into our buildings? Here's another
Erin,
example.
before you go on here, here's a good question from Daniel that's relevant to what you just talked about. Do you know whether let's just say California first, because I actually know the answer for Colorado, but would straw type building meet local building codes?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and it's actually it's approved in the international building codes too, straw bale, and so straw bale certainly is a really achievable, accessible building method. And do you know, Wayne, in Colorado, whether that's regionally approved?
Yes, it is. It is, and we actually had a couple of our other speakers that are building guys that have shown straw bale buildings that they built that code. I've built one that code in Northern Colorado.
Great. And one other thing I'll say about straw bale, oftentimes you'll see there's limited adoption because it's perceived to be more labor intensive. I'd actually like to challenge us to think about labor in a U.S. now where there's 10 million unemployed just with COVID. That I'd like us to think about labor as less of a liability cost and more as an opportunity. Really the opportunity I see in our economic system is to actually decrease the amount of, is actually to turn money into good jobs, solutionary activities that are drawing down carbon to save humanity, and more trees, more carbon, more plants, more sequestration. And the other thing I'll say about labor is there's a number of labor-saving elements of the straw bale that are coming on in terms of prefab straw bale modular panels, and to spray on natural plasters. There's just so much innovation right now in this space. And the other thing is building smaller. So tiny homes, if you spend a little bit of extra labor, but you're doing a smaller home, ultimately your labor budget is that much lower. So there's a lot of creativity that my team at Lift Economy works on when we have a client coming to us. How do I do this and achieve price parity at the market? Which leads me right into Winona LaDuke. So for her vision is really around, as I mentioned, the carbon sequestering hemp as a fiber, as a textile alternative to, our textile industry is 70 to 80% plastic based. If you look down at the clothing that many of you are wearing, it likely contains a good amount of plastic. And we can actually, again, textiles is a place where we can clothe human populations in a way that actually sequesters carbon. And again, the fiber shed world, Sally Fox grows biodynamic cotton in the Capay Valley. And Winona, we're working on a project to grow regenerative organic certification hemp that we can then process and produce fine fibers and textiles with. Okay. Please keep the questions coming. It's really exciting to me to answer your questions as they come. And moving on to the edible landscaping, I do want to call in again the devastating impacts of COVID. I just read an op-ed in Civil Eats by Gary Nabhan around how Indigenous communities, and much of this is largely because of the industrialized nature of our agriculture systems. And so weaving edible landscapes, in my home, I try and eat, 90% of my vegetables come from my garden, really trying to be hyper local focused in terms of where we're sourcing our food. And not only can that have a really big impact if that's scaled across communities, but it can also have a really big impact in terms of addressing some of the inequities around, 90% of leafy vegetables grown and harvested in the U.S. in between November and March comes from Yuma County, Arizona, which is this one county that's seeing this real high spikes in the COVID cases. And so, this kind of taking a systems look around, who grows our food, how it is grown, and do we want to continue contributing to, I like to say it's not as simple as just stopping eating meat, because so much of the plant-based alternatives that are coming into the market right now are actually displacing the industrial ag-intensive meat industry with an industrial ag-intensive plant-based industry. It's still all based on exploitation of labor and exploitation of land. So how a pathway out of that, relocalizing food production to the communities so that there's a direct connection with producer and consumer. Even if you're not going to grow all your own food at home, maybe your neighbor wants to grow some food and you can purchase from them. Maybe the farmer down the road wants to grow food and you can purchase from them. And then systemically, we have to address the communities, the farm labor communities, the migrant worker communities. Why is it? What are the systemic reasons why their food sovereignty has been impacted so much that they're leaving communities to come work in the fields to grow food for U.S. affluent world populations? It's pretty complex, right? We get into layers and layers and layers. But I just want to bring in edible landscape as a really key and critical component to building resilient economies and resilient communities. And I'll just go through these a little bit more quickly because I want to have plenty of time for question and answer towards the end. I want to speak to renewable energy because I think it's up for a lot of people. Certainly when I watched, Planet of the Humans, this was up for me in terms of, wow, well, okay, solar, wind, and some of the data contained in that video was a little bit outdated. But I do think there is a place for renewable energy, especially alternatives such as wind, solar, and even solar thermal. That's not solar photovoltaic, but solar thermal, like actually on Winona LaDuke's White Earth Reservation, the 8th Fire Solar, she produces solar thermal panels. But only if we think about it in the context of dramatic reduction in our energy use, first and foremost. And then secondly, we need to be thinking about who owns these renewable energy. Where is the ownership? And so I'm an investor owner in People Power Solar Cooperative, which is a multi-stakeholder cooperative here in Oakland, California, where I'm actually a co-owner in the photovoltaic solar panels that they're putting up on residential houses. And ultimately, the vision is to change the laws in California to be non-grid tied. And so we could actually have solar power that if PG&E shuts off power, which they've done a number of times due to wildfire risk, which has put our most marginalized communities really immunocompromised, people reliant on respirators and refrigerated medications are the most vulnerable in that situation. If we own our own power source and we can actually own it and keep it running even when the grid goes down, that to me is true resiliency. So I really encourage those that with the bandwidth to go off grid, think about if you have the privilege to be off grid, what community, low-income community in your neighborhood doesn't have that privilege, and how can you help catalyze solutions so that they can go on energy that makes them more resilient in the face of natural disasters too. And People Power Solar Cooperative has ambitions to scale and grow across the US. I could go into ways to reduce your energy use as well, because I do a ton of my cooking is solar cooking. I'm looking at building a bike pedal smoothie machine or blender so I can bike and get my exercise when I'm making smoothies, or I do a lot of cooking from the kale in my garden. And there's a number of other ways to reduce our energy use, and that certainly should be first. And then we should look at the ownership of our electricity and microgrids. Wayne, are there any questions coming up or comments?
Absolutely. And Dina, and I hope I pronounced, I think it's Dina, not Diana, has made a couple of comments and one fairly long question. So I'm going to get to this one. So she says, 350 Colorado is promoting public banking. I have no idea what it will do, how safe it is, and how effective it is. Question, will midwifery require completely independent, transparent banking? Let's stop there because then she's got some more after that.
I love that question, and I have been really wanting to learn so much more about public banking myself. I do consider public banking likely to be more in the hospice of the curve rather than the midwife curve. What I would say, just by comparison, I don't know enough about public banking and how that is going to play out, but I do really admire the work that's being done. To put kind of an alternative frame, I often think as a first term measure, how do I reduce my reliance on finances? Bottom line, how do I first reduce my reliances on money, on fiat currency? And I write about that on ErinAxelrod.com. You can see a few examples of some of my writing about this. So I think when I look at the midwife alternatives, specifically in the realm of currency, I look at time banking solutions. How are we trading time with one another? I look at barter solutions. How are we trading goods with one another? And I look at questioning what we need, right? Hierarchy of consumption. I love, Wayne, that you're creating your entertainment. The way you're meeting your need for entertainment is through jigsaw puzzles and things that are not tied to Netflix, corporate controlled media. There's a lot of room, a tremendous spectrum of places that we can intervene in order to reduce our reliance on financial currency first. But I think the public banking movement is a real imperative to address that systemic layer of how money is spent and invested and traded in these very obscure places that are often so inaccessible even for people to understand that the banking that our government is doing is actually contributing to the extractivism that is causing the problem in the first place. So I love that you brought that question in.
So the second part of her question, which is sort of, you've already addressed a little of it, which is, what is the minimum finance education expected to assess existing and alternative systems? And I'm going to read her comment while you think about that. Mm-hmm. My assumption, civic education is required before any democratic vote because of major disconnect. Normal people on the street have a vague idea and no vocabulary to understand any infrastructure that supports urbanism. Comments. And I think the point, and I don't want to make it more for her, she can put another comment in, is that I agree, we haven't done a very good job in educating about a lot of this. So it's real easy to get the wrong impression one way or the other.
Well, I have another comment on top of that. It's not an answer to that. That's a huge question. I would also say, kind of in a both and framework, Wayne, of what you just shared, we've done a heck of a great job educating people around how to lock them into a system, belief system, sometimes we call belief systems BS, of why capitalism and market-based norms are the only way to a sustainable future. Right. So there's also been over education. For example, I see we get so many emails to Lift Economy. Hey, I really want to make a change. I know that the only way to do that is through intervening in our economic system. I'm going to go get a sustainable MBA. Again, there's a lot that is taught even in sustainable MBAs that I think is propping up and sometimes perpetuating systems of oppression and systems of wealth extraction that are actually the antithesis of what is needed. So I don't have an answer, Dina, to this question of what is the minimum level of financial literacy or financial education. I would actually argue that we need to untrain a lot of what we've learned. We need to go to some untrainings or unschoolings because so the place that I go is really as honorably and respectfully as possible, looking at what Indigenous communities are talking about, what Black and Brown communities are talking about. And those are the places that I lean on for my own education, because so often those are the communities that are taking kind of a holistic social justice lens that is missed in a lot of the system. It's not broken. The system is actually working very well for the ends of accumulation of wealth by the 1%, the white men at the top. That's not by accident. That's actually by design. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm not sure if I took your question.
That was awesome. And this particular phone is going dead. I'm going to go replace it with another one while you answer this next question. This comes from Alicia. Alicia is one of our regulars. She says, COVID-19 will result in a new world normal. Any thoughts on the components of the new world normal if it was the way you think it really could be? I added the last part of that to it. She just said, any thoughts on the components? But go ahead and address that.
Yeah. I have got to say, this is why I do talks like this, is to help expand my imagination of what's possible. components of the new world normal, I'll try and touch on some silver linings. It's pretty difficult and challenging to see silver linings right now because the impacts are so acute on communities that have been already the most impacted by the neoliberal white supremacist agenda of the business as usual economy. But I will say a few things. One is that we are seeing in some of our client companies and some of our investees, we had a small fund called the Force for Good Fund that was fully deployed to 13 amazing social enterprises. And in some of our investee companies, especially the ones that were built around local food security and multi-stakeholder democratic cooperative control, those are the ones that are thriving in these times. I'll back up because I know that was a lot. So when I mentioned multi-stakeholder cooperative control, that means companies that are not owned by just one man at the top, but that are actually, so one example would be a multi-stakeholder farm. Our table in Sherwood, Oregon is a great example of a multi-stakeholder worker-owned farm where the farmers co-own the company, the producers co-own the company, the value-added processors co-own the company, and the landholder co-owns the company. And all four of those stakeholders get down at the dinner table together and collectively decide what the pricing is going to look like across the board. That is radical. That's radical resiliency. And so in that eye-to-eye discussion at the dinner table, the farm workers can see eye to eye with the consumers and can actually hold the shared dilemma of how do we actually create high quality food that is both affordable and values labor adequately and amply. How do we hold, this is a dilemma. This is not a false dichotomy. This is a dilemma that we often say at Lift Economy. Food, organic, healthy, nutrient-dense food is simultaneously too expensive and too cheap. Simultaneously. That's a paradox that every single one of us needs to hold and get really creative about how to solve that together. So I see the cooperative movement has been extremely resilient in the face of COVID. I think more so than individual businesses that weren't linked up to the cooperative movement. And I would say local food sheds have seen a lot of resiliency. We're seeing it in the grain sector, right? People have been baked goods as their new hobby in COVID and shelter in place. The local grain sectors, the community grains of the world, that's in San Francisco Bay Area, and Cairn Springs in Oregon and Pacific Northwest. The grain cooperatives have been extremely resilient in the face of COVID. And so I think to answer your question, a new world is going to be heavily reliant on cooperation, and not just in theory, but in the DNA of how businesses are structured, cooperatives. And it's going to be need-based. So meeting food, water, shelter, clothing security first, not your next tech widget app that we can make a lot of money on. So that's my response. Hopefully that was helpful, Alicia.
That's great. There's one that was a little earlier on. I'll go back to it here. Let me just find it. Yeah, you take a drink while I find this. Oh, here we go. So this was also from Dina, but she said, hello, I'm exploring a local economy systems to be well designed, specifically staple foods production. I would like to join Colorado Grain Chain, which I know of that group. I appreciate your advice on how to position this initiative, how to define local/regional food security.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. I'm gonna, in the chat box, I'm actually gonna put my email in because that question I think might be a little bit more than I can address. I don't want to give kind of vagaries. I'd like to actually speak specifically about your context and your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. So feel free to email me with that question and some more context. and be happy to answer it and actually, connect directly with you and your initiative around what you're trying to accomplish. Thank you for that.
If you don't mind it, then we'll go ahead and put your email address into the little text that we put with our replay for this.
Please
so,
do.
Gina, you can watch it, and then you can reach out to Erin.
Please do. Great.
So, guys, put some more questions in. And, Erin, do you have any other slides? We've got about 12 minutes left here, so we're still in good shape time-wise. So,
great.
Why don't you go back and do some more of your presentation there. It's being awesome.
Great. I'd love to touch a few more themes. So just like I mentioned around the commons ownership of energy, we absolutely have to rethink commons ownership of land. And this ties into Alicia's question around what the new normal will look like. Sorry, I'm not sure you use different wording, so forgive me, but there's a couple amazing initiatives that I want to highlight and uplift. One is the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network in Oakland actually incubated an initiative called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. I didn't put their logo in here, but I'll type it into the chat here so you can look there. It's a long one. I'll type their website too. This is an initiative, especially for those of us who have housing security and are privileged in that regard. So many of our communities are facing extreme gentrification, and the affordable housing crisis, if anything, has just gotten worse due to COVID. And the reason, really, the root cause of the affordable housing crisis in the US is not because of a lack of housing stock. Rather, it is because of the nature of the speculative real estate market, which is contributing to pushing communities that have been long time in neighborhoods out of their neighborhoods due to increasing prices. And so this EBPREC, for short, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, really has a visionary model of community investors coming in at $1,000 a piece, so non-accredited investors, coming in and collectively owning properties and then renting them back affordably to tenants who build equity in the lease arrangement, so that if that tenant needs to move for whatever reason, they're actually, that rent, they're not just pouring their money down a rent black hole that's not building any equity. Rather, they're building equity, and the ownership of that property actually goes into a commons. So we're permanently taking land and housing off of the speculative real estate market. This same thing is happening with the Agrarian Trust, which actually just did a massive launch earlier this month. The Agrarian Trust is permanently taking off of the speculative real estate market farmland, agriculture land, which is opening up pathways for young agrarian farmers who really would love to see a future long-term tenancy on a piece of land that they can steward and implement all these beautiful regenerative ag practices like planting trees, like repairing corridor improvements. But the dynamics of land access in this country and the purchasing land is just completely unachievable for many of the younger generation. And so Agrarian Trust, I highly recommend folks check that out. Donate. If you got a stimulus check, consider donating $1,200 to Agrarian Trust, using that stimulus check to stimulate a recommoning of land and housing. And I think I mentioned it before, but the reason this is so important is it is the nature of having individual ownership, I think, that is perpetuating a lot of like the individualistic thinking and the individualistic decision-making that's happening around the land that fundamentally we all rely on for sustenance. So I really can't underscore that commons ownership point enough as a really key part of the next economy.
I'm just gonna quick. Oh, that's cool. I want you to go to that in a second. I'm just gonna quickly comment.
Please.
The legalities of doing what you described in cities are probably even more difficult than what I'm going to describe. I face. I have a beautiful piece of land that is underdeveloped, it could easily be overdeveloped. I know that I've done all the calculations on this, that I could support 250 people with all their needs off of this particular property. Water, food, shelter, energy, everything, and clothing even, with the right kinds of animals. And assuming that it wasn't necessary to, let's say, put a lot of time and effort into security also, which unfortunately is also an issue that you probably need to worry about if you've got. It could be totally regenerative. In other words, that number of people could make an environment that was better 50 years from now than it is today. And so their activities, well, that's completely illegal here in where I'm at. I could never do that with my property. But I am exploring things like, and I use an analogy, country club models, where again, the land still might be owned by a single individual, but the development rights and the living rights for it are in a membership situation, to where living becomes the same thing as a golf club sort of membership, being able to play golf. So, and that is at least in a gray area in terms of legality, and maybe it's even white, honestly. So anyway.
You bring up so much. I'll just put a couple resources in the chat. I mean, one is the SELC.org, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, is actually has incubated both of these projects, both Agrarian Trust and the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and has helped to change laws around the nature of these things. I know tiny homes laws are changing across the country, which is one way to to kind of push the boundaries of what is legally possible on land in terms of creating those settlements that you described, Wayne. That was such a beautiful articulation of what is needed. And then lastly, I really love, I've been deeply impacted by David Holmgren and his creativity and visionary nature of retrosuburbia. I hope that's the right link. If not, just Google retrosuburbia, David Holmgren. And one of the things I want to say about him is that he has some great lines in this book around, there's kind of two different levels of legislation or governance. There's like the formal institutional regulations, and there's like the informal neighborhood level regulations, if you will. And oftentimes if we maintain kind of a balanced mindset between those two, for example, in California, gray water fell into that gray area, for no pun intended, for many, many years. And I was formative in kind of a gray water program that happened in Sonoma County that accelerated the adoption of gray water. But gray water, there were millions of unpermitted systems before the 2009 code change happened, which made it much easier to achieve a permitted solution. Basically, before the code change, you had to get an engineer's stamp of approval. And this kind of the informal regulation was that nobody was reporting these informal gray water systems to anybody because they were based in kind of intact relationship-based communities. And so if you know your neighbors, if you actively develop relationships, positive working, productive working relationships with your neighbors and the other stakeholders that are surrounding you, I would advocate that we need to do what is right by the planet right now, more importantly than necessarily always abiding. And everyone has a difference of opinion on this. So we'll see, what happens. But I would just encourage us to, stretch the boundaries, educate permit holders. I mean, when I was doing gray water consulting, I would often have, I really had to know my stuff because I would often have a regulator come back to me and say, what you're proposing to do is illegal. And I would actually have to educate them on the code and show them why it was completely permissible. It was just their cultural notions that were so locked into what they couldn't even see in the code was actually permitted. So I just kind of opened a big can of worms there around the notion of permissibility and regulation. But maybe I'll pause there because I know we have 2 minutes.
Make sure you get a little time to explain how you've expanded on this wonderful graphic that we have here. So,
Sure.
So go ahead and talk
Great.
about that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go through that. Like, this is kind of a picture of the building resilient communities sector, and we could have development companies, we could have permanent energy ag and housing cooperatives, we could have funds that are supporting this. If anyone is interested or connected to funding, we, Lift Economy, we would love to connect with a funder who wanted to actually sponsor us. We've done a number of convenings around these topics. In climate change insurance cooperative, that's an area that people could be innovative in. And just briefly, I'm going to go to some of the other slides. This nests with a regenerative agriculture sector, and this nests with a restorative ocean sector, which I don't have time to go into, but I do a lot of work with kind of Bren Smith and Greenwave, restorative ocean farming, where we can actually grow food and fertilizer off the coast in ways that actually enhance our coastal ecosystems. And also, they're 6 times more effective at drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere than land-based terrestrial systems. So restorative ocean economies is yet another sector, and all of these nest together in our mind to create the next economy. And so this really is kind of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're trying to do at Lift Economy, and we'd really welcome folks to join in and join our email list. Contact me if you have a specific project that you're looking for support with. Just thank you so much for your attention and time and interest.
And just as I expected, it was fantastic. And other than my guilt for being late, they couldn't ask for much more. Dina, your comments are all awesome, and sorry we didn't get a chance to just go into a lot of depth on them, but as Erin said, I think she'd love to communicate with you, and it looks like you guys could even could really make some good music together, as they say. Let's just give everybody a chance to put one more question in there. Mark, if you've got any thoughts. Mark's been on thousands of these sessions with me, and he sometimes comes up with some great things. By the way, we were worried about you, my friend. How did the cyclone, is everything under control there?
Yes.
Mark's city, Dhaka, got very badly hit by the worst cyclone in 20 years.
Right.
How are things, Mark?
Right. Yeah, Wayne, thanks for asking. Everything is back to normal, and we had some issues with power failures and internet connectivity, but now it's under control. It'll be good.
And Erin, I want to make sure, we won't do it now, but to introduce you to at least a couple of folks that I think that will also love what you're doing. And one of them is a huge, hoping to have a huge impact on reducing the amount of concrete and sand and valuable resources of that type that you addressed a couple times. And he's got a company in the Bay Area called Blue Planet. Do you know of them at all?
I've heard of them before, but I don't know the founder.
Yeah, they've gotten their seed funding, and they're going to do a pilot scale plant up in the North Bay, and I'll get with you more about it. But another guy here in Colorado who came up with the term agroburbia, Quint Redmond is his name, and I just love, it's so descriptive. And that one slide you showed with the picture of the homes, and why do we need a homeowner association with a little meeting building that gets used 20 days out of the year, a swimming pool, a big open green grass field that has to be mowed every week, and maybe a soccer field. Instead, that could be a farm. Anywhere in the world, that could be a place we grow our food. So, and that's where Quint came up with the whole concept of agroburbia.
I love it.
Yeah. Couple of people giving some nice comments. Thank you. I spent the whole webinar weeding the garden. Really great. Great.
Love
really
that.
Great to,
Thank you for doing that.
See, look at that. You can be listening and weeding at the same time. So here's Erin's connectivity. Erin, any last thoughts that you have before we end?
Yeah, no, last thoughts. I did share one more initiative, which is the nextegg.org. We've been working with trying to access the $29 trillion in retirement savings that is currently, most people have it locked up in a mutual fund or something that is pretty far off from what you want to be investing in. And so we've kind of unlocked a way where you can actually move from your IRA or your 401k into a self-directed 401k that I just last year started my own self-directed 401k. I'll be investing in a eco-village development that's just a block away from my house. And, really being able to align our money with our values is another piece that we're looking at Lift Economy and trying to unlock that for more people, that pathway. Because there's, again, like I said, $29 trillion in US retirement savings. So tapping into that to fund this transformation is a really important piece.
Well, Erin, thank you so much. We are so pleased to have you, and you're doing such great things. Thank you, and
thank you, Wayne.
So we'll meet again, I know, in the near future. And everybody else, we've got a number of other webinars coming up, so please continue to stay strong as a community. Go to our forum. We now have our own forum. You don't have to go on Facebook anymore. You can do your sharing inside our own forum. So, Erin, thanks so much. Mark, thank you.
Bye.
Let's go ahead and take us out.
Bye.